Hello, I'm Megan Bedoyan, and this is my best of the best presentation. So just to give you an overview of what this presentation is going to consist of, I'm going to give you some biographical information about the professor that I observed and interviewed. I'm going to let you know why I chose this professor. I'm going to cover some best of the best themes from the observational standpoint of observing the class, as well as the themes that I observed, or the themes that came up during the interview that I conducted. I'm going to confirm whether or not she was a best of the best professor, what improvements this professor can make, or that I observed, or that she feels that she could improve upon, and then just give some final concluding thoughts. So the professor that I interviewed, I'm going to call Dr. Ohio. Dr. Ohio originally started her education as a French studies major, which I think is very interesting. Once you see the rest of her education, this was an interesting way for her to start her journey. She coached swimming, diving, synchronized swimming, and rowing. And she also got her master's in science degree in exercise and sports studies from Smith College, which is in Massachusetts. After Smith College, she attended Ohio State University, where she attained her PhD in sport, leisure, and somatic studies. I remember vividly that she used to say, "Go Buckeyes," in class all the time. From 1999 to the present day, she is employed at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where she is a kinesiology professor, and the courses that she teaches they're involved in psychology of coaching, or psychology of sports, sociology, race, gender identity issues, and all about how they interact with sport and exercises. So why did I choose to interview Dr. Ohio? Well, Dr. Ohio was the first college professor I ever took a course with. I attended her class. It was an aquatics class. It was a professional activity course, and after reading the description on my way into class in the morning, I was a little leery. I was a good swimmer. I grew up in the water, but I was never formally trained in the swimming strokes, and that's kind of what the class was about. And when I went and spoke to her about it on the first day of class, she really put me at ease and said, if you can swim, if you can tread water, you're going to be just fine. You're going to learn some stuff. But if you ever feel uncomfortable or anything, please come talk to me right away, and we'll work things out. And she definitely put me at ease as a brand new college student, and from that time on, I really looked forward to taking other courses with her. When I did have the opportunity to take more courses, they really had an impact on me. It was there was sociology. It was something that I had never really studied before. Dealing with gender and sport. As a female playing sports all my life, I had never really thought about certain things. Certain things were given to me that I would have the opportunity to play sports. And I was aware of Title IX, but I didn't really know what it meant. And her courses cover those types of topics. And so definitely made an impact on me as a undergraduate student. They also made a lasting impression. Maybe not so much at the time when I was a student. I don't think I really had the capability of taking in the information and using it as much as when I left my first undergraduate degree and really thought about the lessons that I had learned, and they carried on through the rest of my my second undergraduate education, as well as in my professional career. There's a lot of things that I remember learning, actual lectures and class sessions that I can mentally go back to and think of the things that we talked about, and they made an impression upon me in the sense that I used the lessons and it was thought-provoking, and I had a basis to go off of from my original education. So I'm going to focus on 5 themes from the observation of the class that I observed. The class that I observed was Kines 266. It was psychosocial aspects of sport and physical education, or physical activity. And these are, I'm going to go over these in more detail throughout the present. So the first theme that I really observed was she allowed the opportunity for students to assess their own work. Bain says if students can't learn to judge their quality of their own work, then they haven't really learned. The Bain text that I'm talking about is What the Best College Teachers Do, and Paul Travis is quoted in this text as saying this. And in the first 10 minutes of class, Dr. Ohio spent the time reviewing papers that she had just handed back to the students. She said to me in our interview, a lot of times we give feedback, but we don't often take the time to review it in lecture. It's the concept of, here's your paper, here's how you did on it, and that's the end of discussion. And she feels that that's not enough, that they need to go into greater depth because the students want to do better. They do want to do better, and giving them the opportunity to have this dialogue in the class is very important. Before she ended the session with the students, she asked the question to the class, do you have any other questions so that I can help you get an A on your papers? She really is trying to help them. She wants them to succeed. She wants them to write good papers. It's not all about, what grade they have and how bad of a student they are. It's about making them better and having them learn and having it be a process of learning, not just a step by step. After she had this session of review, they went into the lecture, and then at one point in class there was a break. And during this break, I also observed 3 different students come up to her at different times and ask her questions. And she allowed the opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with these students. And when I asked her about it after my observation in the class, she said, they weren't coming up to me to complain about their grade. They were coming up to me to ask me how they could do better in the future. What things could they change? What could they do to do more of, write the paper in the better format, or to use better examples. And she really allows this to, and encourages this type of dialogue to happen with her students. And I thought that was very important for their learning process. I think this is also a really good example of what Fink calls fidelity feedback. The feedback was frequent, as soon as possible. So she handed the test back, and they went over it right away. It wasn't something that they had to wait weeks and weeks to get. It was, the papers were handed back, they had them in their hands. She also acknowledged that once you hand something back to the students, that's where their attention goes. You can't go right into lecture because they're going to be flipping through that paper and looking at your comments. It was immediate. The papers had been turned in quite recently, and this was pretty quick for them to get all the papers back with the grade and with the comments on it. It was discriminating, so she made it very clear the difference between what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. She put up on the projector on the PowerPoint different examples of ways that the students said things in their papers and how they can make it better, as in not putting comments in the present tense, having them in the past tense, and how to better formulate these sentences so that they were appropriate for the paper. It was also very loving. As I said, she said, is there anything else I can do to help you get an A on your paper? She wants them to be successful, and she conveys that to them very, very well so that they do understand that. Another important theme that I observed was that she really uses the lecture as a guide. Bain talks about using the lecture as a way to clarify and simplify complex material. Very much so. When she goes through her lecture, she says, it's a great way to cover a lot of material in a short amount of time, but it's a disengaging way to teach. So she tries to not really lecture verbatim from the slides. My observation was that she kind of clicked through quite quickly, and there were certain areas where she said, this you can review on your own. This is in the textbook in this area. go back and read it yourself. But what she focused on was certain concepts, and she would use examples and personal anecdotes to really communicate those topics and that subject matter better so that the students had a greater understanding. She also interacts and encourages the students quite a bit when she's talking to them. She's walking back and forth. It's not in a nervous manner, but she's not just standing in one place. She's calling out students by name, asking them questions, constantly keeping them engaged and encouraging them to be engaged in the lecture. She also uses questions that are intriguing and tries to come up with different examples that the students can relate to. Bain says that an intriguing question is one of the first elements that make up a natural critical learning environment. There's the questions help the students construct the knowledge of what they're trying to learn, and if they can answer those questions themselves, they're going to be able to hold on to that knowledge that they've just gained. One example from the class I observed was Dr. Ohio brought up the idea that in sports, it's not always a level playing field. Yes, a level playing field would be an ideal situation, meaning that all the athletes and participants would follow the rules. There would be no cheating. Everyone would have equal opportunity. But we know that that's not really the case. And although we kind of assume that that is how sports are, in reality, it's really not. And so, thinking about that and talking about that really engaged the students. It was pretty interesting to watch, their heads kind of tilt to the side, and Dr. Ohio said that she, saw their faces kind of screw up, and it was quiet. The class was kind of dead silent, and then a couple of students raised their hand and they said, "So you're saying this?" And that started the dialogue. You could almost see the wheels turning. It was a really cool experience to see that happening. And it all came from an example of something to better help them understand a certain concept. She also uses a lot of rhetorical questions, and those rhetorical questions are a tool for her. She's asking them, does that make sense? And seeing how they respond. If she's getting a lot of blank stares, she can tell that it's very obvious that she needs to continue to explain and go into it. If she asks, does that make sense? And more than half of the class is nodding their head, then she knows that they're saying that they're gaining understanding of that concept. Another really important observation was the pace of the class. This class was a lengthy class. It was a 2-hour class with a 10 minutes later start, so it's technically 110 minutes. But Dr. Ohio really acknowledged that students are kind of programmed to the 1-hour classes. Most classes in the college setting are just 1 hour long, and the students, as well as herself, are kind of programmed. There's a ramp-up period and there's a ramp-down period in that 50-minute block. Well, when you have an extra long class that's double the time, you kind of have to work into those ramping up and down periods. She also notes that students, they need to get up, they need to take breaks. If there was a lull in the class and she could see his students nodding off or just not really paying attention, she would give them a 10-minute break. During that break, students talked amongst themselves, or that's when they had the opportunity to come to her and further explain a concept in a one-on-one type of setting. She also notes that they need to get their cell phone fix in. Everybody has a smartphone with them, and they need to get their cell phone fix in. Another way that she integrates a break into the class is by allowing them to text in answers to various questions. So what she said to me is that, students are going to have their phones out anyways. They're going to be on them whether I tell them to put them away or not. Well, let's make them use their phone for an educational content, for being engaged in the lecture. And so what would happen was a question would come up on the board, the students would text in their answer. As 98 to 100% of the students responded, she would then close it out, and then they would discuss that question, and then they would talk about it. And that was really interesting. She also said, sometimes she just needs to further explain concepts or with the students. She can tell that, as I said earlier, she can tell if there's a lot of blank stares, and she needs to come up with an anecdote or an experience or an example that really explains the concept better so that it's not just a definition on the screen. So another theme from the observation of the class was that there's a strong will to make unfamiliar concepts familiar, and a lot of this has to do with the personal anecdotes and the examples. Dr. Ohio breaks off into tangents, or what she calls digressions, a lot, and she said, I digress, but I think my digressions make sense. She asked the class a question about what's different between elementary school and college, and the students started yelling out answers like, there's no crayons, there's no nap time, there's no recess. And she went off into a story about when she was young, and she said, I remember a time when there were inkwells in our desks, and she started talking about the little desk and the inkwell, and she was miming her pen dipping into the inkwell in front of her, and how the lid of the desk would lift up, and she's making the noise of the lid. And it's just a visual and auditory explanation that but definitely grabs the attention of the students, and they're kind of looking at her in a sense of, where is this going, and what does this have to do with this concept? And in the end, yes, it makes sense. The story makes sense, and the visual cues, the auditory cues, they really just give you a context and really are engaging and activating different areas of the brain so that they're gaining knowledge in whole new ways. She also encourages students to further understand topics once class is over. The learning isn't just in the lecture session, it's continual. So she encourages her students, she'll say a lot, if you find something outside of class that relates to this, send it to me. We'll have a conversation about it. Maybe we'll bring it up in class. Let's take what we're learning here and apply it to what's happening in the here and now. What's happening in popular culture, what's happening in sports at a current time. And that is just a way to further explain concepts outside of the classroom setting. All right, so let's talk about the interview that I conducted with Dr. Ohio, where she, the themes that I observed were her trust in students, her feeling of a responsibility to help her students learn. Her humility and humble view of herself, diversity in her teaching style, which I've already touched on a little bit, but I'll get more in depth from what I found out. So the openness with students has to do with how Bain describes that highly effective teachers tend to reflect a strong trust in their students. They have a belief that they can learn, and they assume that they want to learn until proven otherwise. Dr. Ohio very much feels the same way. She knows her students want to learn. She knows that they are coming with a certain amount of knowledge, and this, not that they're an empty void for her to fill. They're a body of knowledge that can help her even continue to learn and help her teach. She's talked to me about an example of that morning. She was working with some students who are attempting to change their major, and she talked about that they were making the right choices. They just needed affirmation and confirmation that they were doing the right thing, and they could continue to learn on their own. As I was saying, when she was meeting with these students, she's talked about minimizing their stress and anxiety and empowering them to make good choices. She she knows the students want to be there to learn. They wouldn't show up if they're not going to learn. That's the trust that she has in them. But they need to be able to solve their own problems, but she's just kind of guiding them along the way, not telling them what to do. This is very much how Wardner explains self-directed learning. And the students take ownership in the learning process, and then once they realize that it's what they want to do, as in changing their major, they're really motivated to do things right and to make the right choices so that they can change their major and they can continue on their educational path, the one that they feel is a better fit for them. And they're motivated and they're taking ownership in it, and it's something that's important to them. And that for her is very important. She's seeing that, this is what energizes her, and it all stems from the fact that she's trusting that the students have this ability and this is their goal all along. I asked during the interview that I quoted a quote that said, if we teach who we are, and I said, do you feel that represents you? And she said, absolutely. I first and foremost are wanting to help people. And she told me about that she wanted to go into a health profession, that if she could have been a physician, she would have, but she became a teacher instead. And that has a lot to do with being a coach. She said, I'm a coach. I'm a coach who teaches, and that's how I teach a lot of times, is as a coach would. And that's who she is and how she sees herself, and that's how she feels her teaching is. She feels that she attempts to build on concepts to build their confidence, and that very much relates to how a coach would interact with their athletes as well. They're building on skills to learn how to be active in a competition, learning plays along the way, and strategy, and that builds the confidence. And then so she's trying to build concepts that way to build their confidence. Bain also notes that the best instructors assumed they had a major responsibility to help the students become better self-conscious learners. And that's what Dr. Ohio is trying to convey, I believe, from what she's saying. That's very much her goal. Dr. Ohio also has a humility and humbleness about her and about how she is as a teacher. She said during the interview, I rarely see myself as, a teacher on a pedestal. We're in this together. And when we had this part of our discussion, it was very much about how the students are learning, she's learning. The only thing that really separates her from the student is that she has a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more experience, and she's a little bit older than they are. And that's really all that separates them. They're in this journey together, is how she described it. She's also very open about her weaknesses. In the first few minutes of the interview, she said, I'm not formally trained in the pedagogy of teaching. I'm a coach, and so there's things that I don't always know about the teaching process that she could improve upon, and that is, and she doesn't see herself as this esteemed professor. She sees herself more as a coach who is teaching students in different areas of subject matter. Dr. Ohio also aims to have a really diverse style of her teaching and to touch on different areas. She said to me in the interview that there's no one best way for people to learn. If the brain loves diversity, then, she's going to give the students a variety of opportunities to express and to gain their knowledge. My favorite quote from the interview that I conducted with her was when she said they have to taste, smell, hear. They have to use all of their senses in the experience of what they're learning. And that took me back to when she was talking about being a young girl in elementary school and her desk with the inkwell and the squeaky lid of her desk and hiding things inside of her desk, and I could almost smell the musty classroom and see the ink on her hands and hear the squeaking of the desk and the shuffling of the feet as the students, filed in and sat down at their little desks. It very much created a mental picture that invigorated my senses, and I was able to gain more information about it. And I think she does this on a regular basis, enough to really allow the students to engage more in the concepts that she's trying to convey. There's also the idea that teaching has to be fluid and organic in nature, that there's a balance between the systematic system of lecturing and having assignments out of a textbook and reading that, and the messy, when class kind of diverts off to a different direction and a conversation starts or a debate starts, to not say, oh, we don't have time for that, we have to get this lecture material under wraps. She told me that the class that I observed didn't really go as she had planned that day. She didn't quite cover the amount of information that she wanted to, but it was okay, because they needed to better understand certain concepts, and the only way to do that is to actually get into it and actually talk about it and create examples and ways for them to better relate that information to think concepts that they are familiar with. And the organic nature of allowing that to happen is really important for students at different times, and really helps the process of teaching to the students. So is Dr. Ohio truly a best of the best teacher? Yes, absolutely. I definitely think so. I read her bio on the school website, and it says, "My ultimate goal is to empower students to take responsibility for their learning experiences in the classroom." I think that the idea of empowering students and allowing them to take ownership of their learning experiences is really important, and allows the students to better learn topics and to have a better base of knowledge. And she's definitely fostering that as a professor. She also told me that she's more interested in doing what she can to increase their motivation to learn, versus how much they can remember what she taught them. She, in our discussions, she said, the students, they're going to forget stuff that I taught them tomorrow, or they're going to leave class and they're going to go have coffee and they're going to forget what we talked about. But if they can feel confident in their ability to go out and get that information, then that's an important concept and an important accomplishment for them. It's not so much about knowing facts and memorizing facts, but being able to know how to go back at a different time and space in your life and be able to find that information again and feel confident that you're going to understand it because you already have that base of knowledge somewhere. Dr. Ohio will be the first to say that she has room for growth and improvement, and I would agree with her that we're constantly learning and growing. She said that lectures are kind of her weakest area. And number one is giving examples for different topics, and especially topics that are controversial or that make either her feel uncomfortable or students feel uncomfortable. That sometimes it's hard to come up with something, an example or some anecdote to better help people understand that, to get past that uncomfortableness and be able to have a true and open conversation. So that's something that she feels she can work on. She also talked a lot about her mentors that have helped her along the way and that have given her ideas, and she said that she can continue to learn from those people, and and maybe observe them more and see them and see what they're doing and what's successful for them so that she can in turn be successful herself. Another good thing for in the future would be to have people give her feedback, to observe her classes and give her feedback over what's working and what's not, what they see as helpful to the students, what they see as engaging the students. Sometimes when you're standing up at the front of the class, I think it's very easy to see the head nods, but maybe they aren't quite getting it. And I think that's an area that, a way that she can improve on overall in the future. So finally, I want to just say that this was a very extremely valuable experience for me. As I was reading Bain's book, I instantly thought of Dr. Ohio. And I kind of could feel myself nodding my head and thinking back to experiences that I had 10, 11 years ago in my undergraduate education. And these reading the text and then having the opportunity to interview this professor again really was made me see again how successful she was in teaching for me, and made me in a sense want to emulate a lot of the practices that she uses, because I think they were very impactful in my education. It also really reminded me of my educational journey and where it started, and why, why am I so passionate about what I do professionally, and where is my foundation in my education and what's led me to where I am today. And this was just a very retrospective activity that made me think more about my future, and if I do go into teaching eventually, what kind of things do I want to teach and how do I want to teach it? And the subject matter that I really responded to as an undergraduate, will I have the opportunity to integrate those topics into my professional career in the future? And that was really interesting for me, and I really appreciated the opportunity, and really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I hope it was somewhat entertaining for you. My references for the and the sources for the images that were seen throughout the presentation.